Hello class, this is Professor Hasselman and this is History 107. And in today's lecture we're going to be talking about the world economy from 1450 to 1750. In the last lecture we talked about the early modern period in the same time period, and now we're going to focus a little bit more on the economy. Now, in the early modern period, world trade increased, becoming literally global and seeing an increasingly powerful role for the West. Above all, trade became more important to many societies, helping to shape not only economic life, but political and social systems as well. Now, with the growing importance of trade in such products as slaves, sugar and silver, guns, and elite craft items, a number of societies began to develop elaborate relationships of superiority and dependence. Now, Western Europe became the superior player. It had strong governments and flexible wage labor system, and it emphasized manufactured products such as guns or luxury furnishings that could earn top money in world trade. The West also carried the trade in its ships and commercial companies, other sources of profit. On the other hand, peripheral societies exported cheap foods and raw materials using coercive labor to cut costs and to respond to labor shortages, relying on merchant companies and ships from the European core in importing more expensive items. Now, weak governments followed from the lack of an ample tax base, the interference of the West, and the desire of landlords to regulate their own labor forces. Wealth flowed from the periphery to the western core. Latin America, the Caribbean, and the North American South were the classic peripheries, but West Africa, with its slave trade, had peripheral characteristics. Now, by the 18th century, grain exporting regions such as Poland, which relied on serf labor, were becoming peripheries also. The biggest problem with the world economy approach for the early modern period involves the continuing success of Asian economies headed by China. Now, we will take this complexity into account as we discuss the world economy. Now, the main development underlying all others in the early modern period was the intensification of world economic relationships and the inclusion of the Americas in these relationships. When we discussed the world network in the post-classical period, we mentioned that it was capable of affecting basic manufacturing patterns, as in China, for example. When we look at the early modern period, we see the same kind of intensification operating at a higher level in a set of different economies. Now, Emanuel Wallerstein, an American sociologist, developed world economy theory to explain this intensification. The theory is a useful device for exploring relationships in the early modern period and even in the present day. Now, in addition to illustrating general points about intensification, world economy theory has three advantages. First, it clarifies systematic inequalities in international economic relationships that emerged in the early modern period, and thus helps explain why societies otherwise as different as Latin America and Poland can be viewed through something of the same lens. Second, it deals with relationships between export and import activities within societies, economic position in the world economy, and even political structures and labor systems. And third, it helps to explain why certain patterns endure for so long and why they are hard to eliminate. We should note, however, that world theory or world economy theory has been widely criticized for omitting certain factors such as culture and technology, and for oversimplifying some points. The theory also has difficulty in dealing with change and does not do justice to the complexity of patterns in Asia. Now, Wallerstein introduces four key concepts, three of which we will discuss in this lecture. He identifies core and peripheral societies, the winners and losers in the early modern world economy. Now, because not all societies were fully enmeshed in the world economy at this point, Wallerstein also brings in external societies, in which the economy is not primarily dependent on global relationships. Now, Wallerstein argues that these economic relationships, particularly the crucial duo of core and periphery, are born with the early modern period. Now, although elements of these relationships existed in the post-classical period, they became more rigorous in the period that we are discussing. Examples of core societies include Spain and Portugal in the initial phases of the early modern period, and Britain, France, and Holland by the 17th century. Now, a core society makes profits from the world economy by exporting finished goods, organizing the trading companies that direct world commerce, and building and running the ships that carry trade. In the long term, the core society profits from the world economy because of its capacity to control activities and facilities in these three categories: exporting finished goods, organizing the trading companies, and running the ships. Now, economic advantage, however, is closely linked to political advantage. In Wallerstein's view, core societies not only have profitable economic relationships internationally, but they also have fairly strong states. As a society profits from the international economy, tax revenues increase, enabling the society to fund a more elaborate system of government. And with a strong government backed by a strong military, a core society can intervene in international situations in ways that will help position its merchants advantageously. Now, Wallerstein also argues that core societies increasingly adopt wage labor systems, using wages to motivate workers and to locate workers where manufacturing opportunities exist. Now, those are the core countries. Peripheral societies are the mirror image of core societies. Peripheral societies have dependent economies through which they import expensive products primarily from core societies and export raw, unprocessed goods. Trade in peripheral societies is carried by merchants from core societies and depends heavily on ships from core economies. Now, obviously, peripheral societies tend to lose money in international economic exchange, and they are just as fully engaged in trade as core societies, but their engagement involves systematic disadvantages. Now, peripheral societies have weak governments because they do not have the tax revenues to strengthen government. And the core societies have a stake in keeping these governments weak so that their own merchants and interventions will not encounter resistance. Peripheral economies, at least in the early modern period, do not rely primarily on wage labor, but on forced or coercive labor, slavery, or harsh serfdom. Now, these economic, political, and social system or labor system relationships are easily uncovered in the early modern period. The core societies initially were Spain and Portugal, although ultimately their positions slipped. In the end, the great core societies that were those in much of the European Northwest, France, Holland, Britain, and others. These societies spawned large trading companies that organized trade and sent out ships. These societies also experienced a significant and steady increase in manufacturing, including both craft manufacturing and domestic or home production. In using Wallerstein's theory, we need to guard against oversimplification. For example, although France and Britain were both core societies, France had a much stronger government and military than Britain in the early modern period. The classic periphery society, of course, was Latin America. Latin America produced sugar, silver, wood products, and other goods that were mostly sent elsewhere for processing. In its colonial period, Latin America experienced quite weak governments. Latin American societies featured essentially versions of serfdom the encomienda and hacienda systems, in which laborers were forced either to work certain days or to turn over certain percentages of their products. Now, Wallerstein notes that by the 18th century, peripheries were developing in parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. There, amid harsh serfdom conditions, emphasis was increasingly placed on producing grain for sale in Western markets. In this trade, we see Polish reliance on the export of relatively cheap products carried in Western ships in pattern organized by Western merchant companies. West Africa can also be seen as a periphery economy if we argue that slaves constitute unprocessed goods. African slave systems developed through a combination of African merchant and political organization, occasionally with some direct European intervention. Slaves were then sold to European traders and transported by European ships and commercial companies. In return, African merchants and political figures received processed goods from the core societies. In looking at the peripheral societies again, we need to be aware of oversimplification and some other rough points in categorization. For example, although West Africa was a peripheral society, its governments were much stronger than those of Latin America and much more capable of regulating European activity. As European intervention increased in India and what is now Indonesia, economies there developed some peripheral characteristics, although they did not shift entirely to a peripheral status. Now, the British colonies in North America also present problems of categorization. The South, with its concentration on the production of sugar and other goods for sale to Europe, clearly was periphery. The Middle Colonies and New England, however, did not fit easily into Wallerstein's scheme. These areas had a significant local merchant class, engaged in some manufacturing, and ran some shipping, but they were not yet core economies. The key issue in Wallerstein's theory, however, is Asia. Wallerstein does not deal with Asia in great detail in his treatment of early modern period, but the implications of his work suggest that Asia must be viewed largely as an external economy. That is, the Asian economy was not sufficiently involved in world trade to be affected by world trade dimensions. This position of being an external economy feeds and is fed by misperceptions about Asia's economic role in the world in this period, including its degree of isolation and disdain for commerce. If we dispel these notions, the idea of externality must be largely dispelled as well. Now, Japan had the one clear external Asian economy by the 17th century. Around 1600, the Japanese cut off elaborate contacts with the West. Without question, Japan's economy was not a significant participant in world trade patterns in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because Japan recognized the utility of maintaining some outlet to the wider world, however, the Japanese did allow the Dutch to trade near the port of Nagasaki. Now, externality was not complete, but Japan fits the external category fairly well in this period. Indeed, the early modern period saw considerable development of commercial operations in Japan, although not as a result of external economic relations. For the Middle East, India, and particularly China, however, externality simply does not apply. China received the largest amount of New World silver of any society in the 16th and 18th centuries, largely as the European solution to its old balance of payments problem for Chinese exports. Now, this flood of silver into China had significant impact. In the 17th century, for example, the Chinese government decided that all taxes must be paid in silver currency. This requirement almost certainly resulted in increased inequality for peasants. China could not possibly earn this much New World silver and be regarded as an external economy. But it is not exactly core either, because Chinese merchants and ships did not go out into the world beyond Southeast Asia. China was a manufacturing powerhouse, but not for foreign trade purposes, a commercial powerhouse. China had a strong government and traded actively with Southeast Asia, but on a global basis, it did not operate as a core society. Now, some of the same points apply to India, at least until the 18th century. India was the second largest recipient of New World silver because the Indians also had a variety of goods that Europeans desired. India, however, had little need for European goods during the early modern period. By the 18th century, with increased foreign intervention in India, its position shifted into a more dependent category, but for most of the early modern period, both India and the Middle East had some advantage in trade with Europe. Now, a modified view of the early modern world economy system makes sense. With regard to Latin America, Africa, and some parts of Eastern Europe, European economic dominance is real. It is a source of new profits for the West and new patterns of economic and political activity for the peripheral societies. Nonetheless, this is not yet a world system, and it must be modified to account for not only the decline of Spain and Portugal, but the new position of India. Wallerstein's picture is further complicated by such factors as population shortages and cultural attitudes. Now, properly adjusted, Wallerstein's theory explains why different societies fell into systematic patterns of inequality in the international marketplace in the early modern period, and why this system tended to be so persistent. It is possible to fall out of the core, as Spain and Portugal did, but it is much more difficult to climb out of the periphery.